Well, all right. Dr. Butler and I had talked about sharing this because it was an experience we both got to have. I see a lot of comments on the reporting on this conference saying there's a really small group. The rest of us would have liked to have been able to hear some and be part of it. So that's kind of what this sharing is for. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Laura Wibberding. I teach history and church history specifically, and am the interim department chair for the history department at Pacific Union College. I came to the October 20 to 22 conference on Ellen White largely as an observer. I got to see the historians who are also the history, telling the story about our church's understanding of Ellen White. And that's the perspective I have to share. Jonathan, you want to?
Yeah, hi. What's it saying here? Got it? Should I hit that? That's for the recording. Yeah, this will be fun. I enjoy doing this with Laura. I knew her before she attended the conference, but she was kind of a discovery for me at the conference. I enjoyed her being there. And part of the fun of this conference was not just the formal sessions, but getting to know people at meals and chatting it up between events. And we knew that would be the case with the conference, that it was the informal interactions that would mean so much. So
John,
we're doing this together, and it makes it a lot more fun than doing it separately. We have not practiced this. This will not be polished, but that's probably what's good about it. So
John, could you give not to any great extent, but I know that your friend Eric had a part in setting this conference up, and how did it get started, and how did you sort of define it as you got together?
Yeah, let me talk about that. Laura, should I just do the appeal now too?
Why?
Or do you want to put that on the screen? I mean, I can talk about Eric, but how do you want to do it?
Well, I just thought people would probably like to know why you guys got together. You know why you got together. The rest of us don't.
Right. Yeah. Well, this was really this was Eric's brainchild. It started a number of months ago when Don McAdams published his book on Ellen White and the Protestant historians, and this was digging out old research he had done back in the 1970s that was never published and kind of shelved by the White estate. And all these years later, Oak and Acorn said they were going to publish it. So, that book came out, and Eric began thinking, and not alone, but he was talking about this with others and saying, we need to get together and talk about the future of Ellen White, not just more discussion of what we've learned about her in the last 50 years from many of the historians, and some of them, many of them revisionist historians who are sort of finding new information about her, which isn't always the most complimentary. We learn about her imperfections as a writer and as a person and so on. And so where do we go from here? Let's stipulate that what was said by Numbers and what was said by McAdams and Walter Ray and all that is pretty much accurate. But what are we left with then with Ellen White? And so Eric, got together a group of people that he thought, first of all, had done work on Ellen White and knew about her, but also were compatible, could get along in a room together. There about 20 historians he invited, he kept the list short in part so that people could, things could remain informal. And so we met on October 22 and hoped it would not be a disappointment. And it wasn't. It worked out very well. And we were there for basically a 3-day weekend. And you know, discussing Ellen White candidly, openly, appreciatively, positively. But the point was, let's not further deconstruct her. Let's reconstruct her. Let's talk about what we can say about her and do with her in the future.
And to be said, Eric is Eric Anderson, professor.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Professor from PUC. Those who
That's
don't
right.
know
And
him.
twice a college president, and taught for many years at PUC. And I knew Eric from our graduate school days back in the 70s. That's when we met, and our wives and he and I all sort of were inseparable over the years. And so we were close, and he did the lion's share of this, but he was very collaborative and would ask for input, and he was not autocratic in the way he did all this.
Yeah. So I have some pictures from the conference, and we have documents to share. I'll need to share my screen since John and I are both going to be using the visuals from my screen. So I don't know if we need to.
Do I have to do anything?
For presenter view.
You're already a host, Laura. Go ahead.
All right. So, see, I'm used to doing this the other way, where I just have my screen inset in my video. So, see, I'm feeling dinosaurish in this. I called this Ellen White, What Now? But it's about the future of Ellen White, since the historians have done their work, and we, as Eric Anderson said, we've had plenty of time to absorb the fact that there's a previous version of what Ellen White did and how she worked that was inaccurate, and we figured out it's inaccurate, but what do we do now? This photo is a photo taken from the last day of the conference. It's not perfect lighting, but you can recognize some faces there, and some of them are on this meeting today, like Denny Fortin is there. And Ron Grable, you can see his comments in the chat. He's giving you some good information there. You don't see me in this picture. And the reason is this. See, I was taking the picture. I had to stand on one of the historic tables to do it. But I masked up because I came to the conference at some peril. I had been exposed to COVID, so I tested every morning and I wore a mask. And when we had meals, I would go to another place to eat, then put my mask back on so I could come back in and talk to people, because I didn't want to miss the chance to visit with all these people that were pretty exciting to me, as not just the historians, but people who'd experienced this history that they were discussing. This is the downstairs conference center room or meeting room in the UT Center, which is a portion of the PUC library now. And you can see our new UT Center director there sitting on the couch. And this was a really nice place to visit. You can see the Eric standing there getting ready to get us started, but people were milling about, hanging around. There's George Knight, Ron Grable, and Don McAdams. Don McAdams presenting. That's right, somewhere in here, I was going to give you a rundown on who was speaking and about what. George Knight started out in a presentation called Changing My Mind Painfully, about shifting his more fundamentalist thinking about Ellen White. Don McAdams told the story about discovering historical inaccuracies in the Great Controversy, and how he tried to work with the church, because clearly when he looked at it, he could see that Ellen White had used some historians, and not all the content that she'd used had been accurate. So his was titled How the Brethren Should Have Responded, a Counterfactual History, because of course, but there was promise that the church was going to do something about this information. In the end, things got too heated and they did not. Then after lunch, Jonathan Butler talked about the book I Never Wrote, and I'm sure he can tell us more about that one, if he was going to write a biography of Ellen White now. Here we've got Larry Garrity. Then I'm out of order, I think. Yeah, because that was from the last day. We had Katie Van Arsdale. She works at the Center for Adventist Research at Andrews University, and she was talking about the ways in which AI has opened up our capabilities of searching and studying Ellen White's writings. There's even some promise that you could teach an AI bot to read her handwriting. And as you know, human scholars struggle to do that. Ron Grable can tell us all about that, the complications of reading her handwriting. But she was showing that how AI can give more advanced and more nuanced searches, and we're going to just have an explosion of new information that we'll need to deal with.
You can bring her in.
Have an image. Some of our meetings were not in the conference center. This is in a side room of the dining commons here, and Denny Fortin was talking about Ellen White as a devotional writer, and his own experience with Steps to Christ, particularly. Paul McGraw talked to us about the prophetic homilist, and he said that Eric had insisted he couldn't use the term homiletician, or homileticist, anyway, some term. Talking about Ellen White's writing and how it, how we can use it now, and how it works with the paradigms of devotional or homiletic writing, preaching essentially. I had to throw in that one. There's John giving some wisdom here. On Sabbath afternoon, we met in the president's house. This is Gilbert Valentine, talking about reflections on Ellen White's temperament, discussing ways which you can read about them in the current Adventist biography series about other Adventist leaders, ways in which Ellen White's personalities and her perhaps shortcomings do show up in her relationship with others, and sometimes in her work there. This is the part that people have been very curious about. What was said there? Well, it's not a big secret. It's largely things that you can read if you read those Adventist biographies. Sunday morning, Terry Ament talked about reconstructing Ellen White and what path that might take, and there was a good discussion there. And then finally, Larry Garrity and Ron Grable talked about revisions we might make if we were going to have the privilege of writing the fundamental belief statement on Ellen White and the gift of prophecy, which they presented something that the group did accept. And then we talked about the final statement, the where to go from here statement. This was part of the fun for me, hanging out with cool people like this. George Knight, my seminary professor, and of course, I got to know Jonathan Butler and his wife, particularly visiting after Sabbath lunch, and hope to partner some more for this. This is me risking everyone's lives. It turned out I never did get sick, so probably not really a risk to everyone's lives, but trying to get in a photo here. So that's an overview of the conference, and I'm just going to advance the slides for Jonathan as he tells you about the documents that we we discussed and agreed on.
Yeah, that's great. Laura took extensive notes on the conference. A number of people were scratching notes, but hers were the most complete, and she sent them to me, and she's the perfect one to go through those. She just gave you a quick overview, but the people that spoke, there were two documents really. The first one is Ellen White for Today, an appeal. And we'll talk about that one, which I think is a key to understanding the conference and why it was held. And then we'll look briefly at the belief number 18 and how it reads, but then how Larry Garrity and Ron Graybill suggested it ought to read, doing some editing on it. But let's look at the appeal first. The appeal opens with the fact that SDAs are in crisis, and I'm just going to kind of underscore or italicize a few things that are said here. Ellen White appears to have less influence among SDAs now. She's spoken of less. She's thought of less highly, perhaps, among some, particularly in the United States and Europe and Australia. It can be different in Latin America or Africa or Asia. There's kind of two camps that have formed. There's the people that think Ellen White can still do no wrong. And there's the other camp that seems to imply that Ellen White can do no right. And they're sort of at odds within the church. We've gone through some 50 years of careful deconstruction of Ellen White, critical, kind of historical, critical study of her. We try not to blame it on the historians. It's what they do. They want to study things historically, and her imperfections turn up. As a writer, in particular, that was sort of the first explosion. As a contextual figure who's been influenced by those around her, and as Laura talked about with the Valentine study, her personal flaws in relating to other people. Maybe the best source for that, if you're beginning on that topic, is to look at Valentine's biography of John Andrews. And toward the end of it, you see some rather scathing correspondence from Ellen White to John Andrews, who, if there were a saint in Adventism, he'd be one. So you say, well, is this just an angry woman going off on him? What is happening here? So those kinds of imperfections, and what do we do with them? Not let's wallow in them and sort of harangue about them. What do we do now with the Ellen White we know better than we did perhaps before the 1970s? Seventh-day Adventists are quite aware of their debt to Ellen White. I think many of us would not have done the schooling we did, or gone into healthcare, or raised our children in just the way we raised them without Ellen White. I mean, we know we owe her, but how should we think about her now? Americans owe Thomas Jefferson. They owe Abraham Lincoln. But in countless biographies, you learn of the flaws of these people. Lutherans owe Martin Luther. But they also have to come to terms with his humanity. Ellen White.
Sorry to interrupt, John.
Yeah.
you're kind of giving commentary on this. Should I be scrolling through so that we can see the of the appeal
yeah,
you've been,
yeah, go ahead. I mean,
or is this a preface?
yeah, no, this is it. I've been scrolling through, but that's fine. Yeah, yeah, they haven't read this, right? They haven't read this appeal.
Well, it was available to read. There we go.
Yeah, yeah. I wasn't thinking
Right,
about
so
that.
we've already passed
Yeah.
this part.
We did put
No, we're
links
talking
to
on
it
this.
in the announcement to the class. We did put links in for
Okay.
the statement and for the write-up that Eric gave. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And we're acknowledging, I think, people at the conference who many of them have spent their lives working on Ellen White, acknowledge, she was a remarkable person, to whom we owe, as it says here, the way the one word is blocked out, Laura. What is that? Personal debt for her in, what's that word that starts with an H?
Oh, you can move the place where your little box is on the screen.
Yeah,
Trying to see where you.
yeah, there it is. How we live. Yeah,
Okay.
how we live, work, and hope. Um, you know, there are people in the medical school at Loma Linda taking medicine who are angry about Ellen White, but you have to point out the fact that they wouldn't be in medical school. There wouldn't be a medical school at Loma Linda without her, and the emphasis on health and so on. So we acknowledge that, but what sort of Ellen White can we now believe in? And is she going to be a Joseph Smith for us? Or is she going to be a John Wesley? And that's kind of the Ellen White you understand and relate to is the church you're going to be in a certain sense. So whatever her imperfections, is she still able to lead us to Jesus? I think that really was what conference members hoped to discuss and to convey to a larger world out there. So that was the appeal, it was called. Eric wrote the appeal, but he collaborated on it and sent it around to all of us, and we all put in our 2 bits. And I think it came out to be one of those statements that virtually everybody could agree to at the conference. Not that it solves all the problems, but now this is the other major statement, a proposed revision of belief number 18, right? And now, Laura, this is the original statement.
This is actually the revised version.
Okay.
To keep it simple, I put up the revised version, and then there's a note down below saying things that are in the original version that were left out of this.
Yeah. Well, that's what maybe scroll down a little bit to what was left out. I think it's fairly important to see.
It's actually just all on this screen here.
Oh, it is here. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I see what you mean. There it is. Yeah. That line next to number 1 there. The gift, Ellen White's gift, is an identifying mark of the remnant church. That line in the revision or phrase was crossed out. And then the second phrase, speak with a prophetic authority.
Yeah, in the 3rd sentence, her writings, we dropped speak with prophetic authority before the part where it says provide comfort.
Yes, okay. In a general way, I think the revisions that Ron Graybill and Larry Garrity they did quite a study here. They went back and looked at statements over the decades and what had been said about Ellen White and claimed about her. And when they finally, if they ran the world, they would make the statement more like this. And I think there were two things that, and Ron's here, I think, so he can talk about this. But I think two things that they were trying to address. One is to scale down the sense of exceptionalism. Seventh-day Adventists kind of treat Ellen White like they're Fort Knox. This is what gives the community great value over other religious communities, and they're trying to say, no, let's not overpraise ourselves for having an Ellen White in our midst. The other thing that I think they had in mind is that there's a kind of implication in many of these statements about her in belief number 18 of inerrancy. Her authority is sort of paramount and unquestioned. So that made them uncomfortable as they looked at them. She's a gift. She should be taken as a gift. She's of great value to the church. We would not be who we are without her. But let's not say we're head and shoulders over everyone else, and let's not say we can do no wrong because we have her.
I'm wondering, since Ron Grable is here, if he would like to make a comment on this.
Is he muted? I've never seen him mute.
Yeah, let me make sure that I get Ron on here. Ron, I'll find you and ask you to unmute here in just a moment.
Unmuted.
There he is.
What would you like to add to this, Ron, since this was your work here?
Let me just explain a couple of things about this. We argue that we should leave out this phrase about her being a mark of the remnant church, because that's based on a faulty exegesis of the text in Revelation. And we had a couple of good New Testament scholars who pointed out the problems with the exegesis that makes Ellen White prove that we're the remnant church. So we decided we would suggest leaving that out. Now, the other one about leaving out. Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting. I understand from your research that was added in the 1950s, that remnant church statement.
I don't recall right now. I sent John the whole PowerPoint, and there is a place there. But yeah, I think it hasn't always been that way, and they're different. They're different formulas and different changes that have been made over the years in our official statement about Ellen White.
Yeah, she's right. It was 1950, I think, that it happened.
Yeah.
The other one was 1980, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, now
the W.H. Branson era that first statement came in. Yeah. Anyway.
Now, as for the prophetic authority, what does that mean? I think she speaks with prophetic authority. For the very conservative among Adventists, that means that she overrules anything that the best history or the best science or the best exegesis might say. Even if she disagrees with that, her authority overrules all of those things. So it's an ambiguous statement. Yeah, I think she speaks with prophetic authority, but that is not infallible authority. Furthermore, in the next line of the fundamental belief, you say all you need to say about what her writings do. Her writings provide comfort, guidance, instruction, and correction to the church. Now, that's a passage from the Bible, and it says the scriptures do that. And yes, so she does what the scriptures do, but in subordination to the scriptures, and so on. So I think that I don't expect Ted Wilson to be pushing for this revision, but I'm happy to live with it.
Thank you, Ron. Let
I
me.
think I'm gonna stop screen sharing too, so that we can see each other's faces better.
All right. Let me throw in a question here that perhaps some of you, one of you, you can decide who's going to answer it. As in my role as an editor who receives manuscripts and ideas from people and who watches the comments that people make, when we do anything about if Ellen White ever comes up, and any of you who were there can answer this. I'm getting a lot nowadays of the school of Ellen White was a pious fraud, and there is nothing there that is worth our looking at. Even if she says something true, we don't need it because she was a fraud. She set out to defraud the church, to make money off the church, to become an authority in the church. She was just a pious fraud. And I have a hard time with that. I don't use articles like that come in. But there's been a couple of books come out lately that have that tone. And I was wondering, did that come up in your meeting? And did you address that idea? We get it from Steve Daly and to some extent from Casebolt. Is it Don? Don Casebolt.
Yeah.
Those sorts of ideas. Did you wrestle with that?
Do you want me to talk, Laura?
Go ahead, John.
Yeah. Yeah, that it was alluded to, I think, that sort of prophet fraud dichotomy. It wasn't, you know, a whole session was never built around it at all. But let me just talk just a little about that. I can understand some of the feeling there and some of the place from which that sentiment comes. I have a feeling sometimes that Seventh-day Adventists were taught by Ellen White in elementary school, and she beat them with rulers, and they're kind of upset about it. It probably was not so true that she did that. I only mean that metaphorically, but maybe the wrong Bible teacher was spouting Ellen White, or the wrong parent. My general concern with the whole idea is that it's too binary. You're either of God or of the devil. When in fact, there's a lot of gray in between. It is an approach that Ellen White herself took. She said, I'm either of God or I'm of the devil. You can't say my testimonies were just my opinion. Well, in many cases, they were just her opinion, or they were gossip she had heard, or a passage she had copied. But she wanted to be taken either as one or the other. And I think many of these people who adopt the prophet fraud paradigm for her, she's either all good or all bad, are in a sense devoted to Ellen White and accepting Ellen White in a way they probably shouldn't. They're more fundamentalist, perhaps more Seventh-day Adventist than they care to admit. I think it's very difficult to decide who's pious and who's a fraud. It's a very delicate process. I think I'm willing to say that David Koresh was a fraud. In other words, I don't think you need to come up with a paradigm that says everyone is a prophet, no one's a fraud. I think there are frauds. But to really determine that is not an easy task. And just to sort of write exposés and downgrade someone, you need a little more than that to really establish fraudulence.
Yeah, and as Carmen said, intentionally fraudulent, I think is what we're talking about.
Yes.
Ron or Laura, do you want to join in here?
This is Ron. Let me just say that my wife and I have been on our evening walks. We've been listening to this book called
Under the Banner of Heaven.
Well, no, it's the one about modern messiahs. All the different people in American history who have claimed to be speaking for God or claim to be God or the incarnation of Jesus or something like this. And again, as we listen to the stories about these people, we see, oh, that's similar to they lived in an environment that's very similar to Ellen White's. And, oh, they're interested in the same reforms that she was interested in and everything. And you know, this doesn't prove anything, I would say, but when you look at these failed messianic figures, failed prophetic figures, and so on, who faded away, you realize that although some things Ellen White says are kind of a little shocking or embarrassing, or we would question them and so on, wow, she stands up very well against others who claim this to have the prophetic gift in her time. At the same time, you know, when I raise questions about some of the claims and so on and so forth, I have to say, well, you know, you're a little skeptical when you hear these stories about 11 witnesses seeing the golden plates that Joseph Smith translated from. You should maintain the same objectivity when you look at the claims of Ellen White. But I've just reading about all these other prophets, I just come up with it. And, you know, it's awfully hard. She might have said some things that sound like they're false statements, but falsehood is a matter of intention to deceive. And I don't think we find that intention to deceive.
Well,
Thank you, Ron. Laura?
we had kind of a plan for questions and answers Jonathan and I were going to talk about here, but I feel like our meeting is kind of developing on its own a bit, and we do have more people here from the conference that I wasn't expecting. And I noticed that Denny Fortin was on. Is he still here?
Yeah, I alerted him that we would be possibly.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Yeah. I'm wondering if he'd like to chime in, and I'm wondering if we should focus a bit on I'm wondering if actually all three of you might talk a little bit about your personal experience with Ellen White. And I'd also like to ask everyone, what would you see as the ideal role for Ellen White, and what would be your contribution to making that a reality? But maybe I'm asking too many questions at once. How about your experience with Ellen White? Let's start with that.
Denis?
Okay, I'll start. Perhaps before I say answer that question, let me perhaps relate to one of the comments that was just mentioned regarding the fraud idea. And I think I resonate very much with Ron Graybill here, where we think, you know, we do not see Ellen White intentionally wanting to fraud and to deceive people. And I think everybody that was attending the conference, you know, was of that mind. We did not sense that in the room at all. A few people also have commented over and over on the Facebook post after the conference was related or mentioned, and also today here on the chat. Why all these white folks, meeting together? A lot of them are older men, although we had 2 young ladies attending the conference. And well, we were colleagues, and the conference is self-sponsored. There was not much money to have the conference. People needed to be able to go there a little bit on their own dime. The conference also, according to Eric Anderson, had to be self-sustaining so that the people could come into the room and have a genuine conversation without having to be guarded, without having to explain themselves. So people who knew each other, and so the conversation was going to be honest and genuine, without hiding, and be safe in the room, which is not always the case. Young scholars were not invited because, again, the people that were in the room were experts. They've been there for a long time at it, and they have the experience. We did say, though, however, just to conclude that point of conversation of context, that if it were possible, and if there were to be some good sponsorship and support from the church or from some other entities, we would love to repeat this conference. And at that one, invite young scholars, have a whole lot more diversity when it comes to culture, ethnicity, age, and repeat the same conference and discuss the same topics and come with some suggestions. And what would we do? Will there be buy-in? Will there be support? Will there be money, a place to host this? Time will tell. But that's certainly part of the context. Our context that's not being discussed. So these perhaps are some thoughts on the context that I wanted just to mention. How about Ellen White and my own experience? Well, I did not grow up Adventist. I became Adventist. I was a teenager. The first book that I read was the book Steps to Christ. Those of you who have purchased or bought or listened to presentations I've made on the special edition of Steps to Christ that I published about 6 years ago in 2017. In that introduction, I talk about my journey with the book. I talk about the book itself, how it's been put together by Ellen White and Marianne Davis, and what the book itself is about. To me, Ellen White certainly has been an inspiration. That little book, Steps to Christ, has been a joy for me to read, along with Thoughts from the Mount of Blessing, Desire of Ages, and so on, so many other books of Ellen White. So to me, she has been a blessing, continues to be one. We can read Ellen White from various perspectives. Of course, we can look for fine-tuning our interpretations of Scripture. We can look for commands and directions and what to do with our lives and use that perhaps to thump on the heads of others, or we can read Ellen White to learn something for my own spiritual devotional life and my own growth. And that's the paper that I presented at this conference, How to Read Ellen White as a Devotional Reader, and why can we look at her as a devotional reader? And I'm thinking that if many, many thousands of people in our church who have stopped reading Ellen White would pick her up simply as a devotional reader, maybe they could gain something from it, and that would be good. So that's perhaps a thought I could bring here to that conversation.
Thank you. Ron or Jonathan, do you want to talk about your experience with Ellen White, maybe as a young Adventist or as a historian? I know some of you have quite a bit of history to tell related to it, but the basics.
I wanted to just segue from Denny. His book on Steps to Christ is such a wonderful combination of reading Steps to Christ devotionally and yet also understanding it academically. It's a if you have not read it, and I think many have, but it is excellent, and you can relate to her in a way as an academician. We're not all academicians, but you can relate to her that way. But you can also relate to her personally and devotionally. Yeah, as far as my own personal experience, the religion on our home was channeled through women. My mother, my aunt, and my grandmother, who we referred to as Granny, and they talked Ellen White when we didn't know they were talking Ellen White. I mean, she was just in the home and communicated. So you didn't drink coffee, or you didn't drink Coca-Cola. You didn't play baseball on Sabbath. We would parse this, and my mother would do this. Well, you can play catch on the front lawn, but you can't play in Little League, you know? And we took this, that was fine. When I was in high school, or in academy, we had a Bible teacher who was a walking Ellen White. And maybe many of you have run into this. He was it's like the book Fahrenheit 451, where you had memorized a book and you were that book. Well, he was Ellen White, and would gather us in Bible classes and be Ellen White. And I remember being on a date with a girl. It's hard to believe how old I was. I could drive a car. I could drive a car then. And she had put on rock and roll music. And I said, well, you shouldn't play rock and roll music. And she said, why not? And I said, well, it arouses the animal passions. And so she left me for a boy that did listen to rock and roll music. So this was a painful experience. But in time, I went off to graduate school and began studying American religion, and found I revisited Ellen White in a different way. I was studying her in her 19th century context, what other people were saying when she was saying what she was. And I found it almost inspirational in its own way to be viewing Ellen White through this historical lens. And the way we talked about Ellen White at this conference, which we weren't downgrading her or criticizing her, we were just mulling her over and reflecting on her and what she could mean to us. It was quite different than the high school boy I had been, or the elementary school boy I had been, but no less powerful.
Ron?
Ron. Ron, did you want to talk to us about your experience?
Oh, well, at our age, it's so tempting to tell all these stories. So let me try to be brief. My mother was reared in a family in Michigan where her parents did not believe in Ellen White, because they sympathized with Kellogg in the controversies between Kellogg and Ellen White. So my mother grew up not in an Adventist home, but they didn't believe in Ellen White. Believe it or not, she came to believe in Ellen White from reading messages to young people. What does that say? That says that there is Ellen White, and then each of us has our own Ellen White, and we have the parts that inspire us. And I suspect that most of us, except for the far right, folks on the far, most of us read Ellen White not for her inspiration, but for the inspiration she provides us. So, my mother wouldn't let me go to school until I was 8, because Ellen White said you shouldn't send kids to school too early. Okay, that's all right. We drank Postum, and now we drink coffee, so we are always liberalizing.
Laura, back to you.
Well, I realized one of the most distinctive things I discovered at this conference, I suppose it wasn't a new discovery, is that my concerns about Ellen White and my picture of her is so very different, because I haven't had the same experiences that these our presenters had. I grew up in a little bit of a different time. I'm not like terribly young myself, but I also grew up in a fairly urban, progressive Adventist culture where we didn't really talk about Ellen White. Nobody told me you shouldn't do this or that because of Ellen White, or presented. I never got the subtle message that my life had to conform with all the things she'd written, which meant that when I read Ellen White, the stakes were not so high. The question about whether or not she had borrowed content or whether she was accurate in everything she said wasn't nearly such a big deal in knowing, in making my choices. I didn't feel like I was forced to either discredit her or to conform to her. And I admit that as an avid reader, that I have read a lot less of Ellen White than you might expect for somebody who teaches a class on Adventist history. I teach about Adventist history, but I teach a lot of it to students who are, or some of it, who are not Adventist at all, because, when they come to PUC, they have to learn some things about Adventism. And they don't find it so terrible it's actually easier to tell them, yeah, we have a prophet, but there's this complex and human process by which these writings kind of come about. So I realized that my experience and my conversation is very different. I think that our experience with Ellen White is never really our experience with Ellen White. It's our experience with the church that we were in and the way other believers wanted us to experience her. So it's not simply a generational thing. There are lots of different Adventist subcultures. If you ask my husband, he had a different experience than I did, too. And the fact that there are different subcultures, I think, is actually even promising, because it means that there is no uniform official, there's official church words about Ellen White, but there is no uniform, monolithic, the Adventist belief about Ellen White, because we all have these really different things. The weekend before this conference, I'd gone to a conference on women in Adventist history, and we talked about hundreds of Adventist women in our history. And the one woman we didn't talk about much was Ellen White. But my experience of Ellen White is something of the issue about what she did, and the fact that her example and her ministry promoted and enabled the ministry of so many other women in her time and those people around her. So in my experience, I'm receiving the positive effects of Ellen White's ministry, because it props up my position as a teacher and preacher in the Adventist world today.
Let me dovetail with you, Laura, to say that I envy you. That you grew up with a different Ellen White. But I also think you've made a good point here that we all grow up with our own Ellen Whites, depending on who our parents were or who our church community is. And larger than that, I mean, the global church, I think there's people in Brazil or in Uganda that are growing up with a very different Ellen White than I did. Let me relate an anecdote, which I think kind of addresses this a bit. When I was teaching at high school, and my best friend among the teachers was a fellow who came from a Foursquare gospel background, and he was married to a prophet. And I was quite interested in this. She came out of a Pentecostal background, and she went with her husband, his brother-in-law. They traveled, and the brother-in-law was an evangelist, and she was the prophet. And when he was done with his evangelistic meeting, she would get up and offer what she called a word of wisdom to anyone who wanted to come up from the audience and talk to her. People would come up and say, well, I'm thinking of going, going to college, but I'm not sure of my major. Well, she would talk to them. In our parlance, she would give them a testimony, what they should do. Well, we went to lunch all the time, and we would talk about his wife, and he knew I was working on Ellen White and writing about her. In fact, I'd shown him some of the things I'd written. And he said, well, you need to meet my wife. She's a prophet. And I said, oh, that'd be great. So then we were getting closer to a Christmas party. And she said, well, my wife is coming to the party and she has a word of wisdom for you. I said, oh, good. So I'm going to get my own testimony here. So I show up at the party and she's there, and quite a lovely gal. This guy I knew did not deserve this wife. I mean, she was very lovely and classy, and he was none of those things. But she took me aside and she talked to me, and she gave me her testimony. But what she said to me, because she had been learning about Ellen White through her husband, because what I told, and she said, you've got a problem in your church. You have too few prophets. You have this one person, who's your prophet, and everything she says gets written down, and, people are hanging on every word. And you need a number of prophets. You need a number of prophets in every congregation, because God's message to you is coming through this one person. And with all her strengths and weaknesses, that's the filter. If she has a bad temper, if she copies too much stuff, whatever, that's for you, a prophet. And I thought that was very insightful of her. And then she had her testimony for me, or her word of wisdom. She said, you're doing the wrong thing with your life. You're teaching high school, and that's wrong for you. You should be a Pentecostal minister, which I took as kind of a compliment, because she came out of this Pentecostal background, and she preferred me to be a Pentecostal minister. But I learned, it's strange to learn from another person, from another tradition, about what a prophet ought to be. But I think I learned a great deal from her at that Christmas party.
I too am envious of those of you who had a good experience with Ellen White. For me, Ellen White was primarily about fear of the end times, and rules that you couldn't possibly keep, and therefore you were inevitably going to fail. So anybody, as somebody pointed out in the chat here, they said, really, the best thing she offered us was the opportunity to exalt the gifts and talents of women, and we've pretty much let that one go by. And I think that's a really good insight. Laura, do you want to? Are you ready to take some questions, or do you want to continue with the questions you've?
By all means, let's have some questions. I think we've talked enough ourselves.
All right, Gerald, I'll go with you first. Dr. Lofthouse, retired Dr. Lofthouse.
Yes, enjoying it, learning how to be retired. That's a special skill that they don't teach in medical school. Jonathan, Laura, I appreciate the approach that's made of looking at this and exploring around the edges. But I'm concerned that leaving things to be discerned by the individual tempt a lot of people who came into this church, shall I say, sold on the church by this spirit of prophecy. If they are going to come to grips with Ellen White as you have laid out, that is somewhat qualified, a good contributor, but perhaps not the icon that she has been made out to be, are going to be forced to make a very big decision. Can I believe this church and not believe in Ellen White? And I think I've come to the place that I believe I can do that. And I think many of us in this forum have done that. However, I think altogether too many people are forced to make a choice and will be forced to say, well, then I have to leave the church altogether, and does not allow the church to continue to be a positive influence in their lives. What can we do about this? In some ways, I think we need to uproot this and have a fundamental discussion that can allow the church to actually be exposed for what it seems to have become. Otherwise, we end up with people forcing themselves, if they're honest, to leave a reasonably good church.
This is a really good concern. If you look at the history of Ellen White critics, I mean, not just say scholars pointing out inconsistencies, but people who were really going in on the offensive against Ellen White, then this isn't to invalidate their arguments, but usually they had an experience where they had been sold an inaccurate promise of who Ellen White was and what how inspiration was working for her, and just what her work was supposed to be. And we can go into conversation about how they were sold that and why they were sold that. But the feeling of betrayal is understandable. So this can't just be a private conversation. It concerns how the church sells itself. There was an era in which we like to say, look, prophet means remnant church, means you have to do the difficult task of removing yourself from your other Christian community and moving to ours because this is the only way to be saved. I don't think the church wants to sell itself in those terms anymore, but this does need to be a conversation, not just among scholars, but also among Adventist evangelists, because we don't want to repeat this sale of something that's false and inaccurate in the future.
Yeah, I think that exposes us to no longer being a reasonably good church. I said that phrase intentionally because I think there are many Christian churches that are reasonably good Christian churches. I'd like to have ours be one of them. Jonathan, what do you think?
Well, you make a very good point. I think of growing up with my mother and father, and when I was a child, they could leap tall buildings with a single bound. They could do no wrong.
Right.
But by the time I'd gone through adolescence and gotten into college and so on, I had different views of them. They were still my parents, and I still loved them, but I didn't have this Superman, Superwoman sense of them. And I think that is true of Ellen White as well. Your point that there are people that have promoted her in unrealistic ways, I think is right on target and unfortunate. But they may be on a different place on that continuum of childhood to adulthood. I think of the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, and he said we grow up with a primitive naivete. We're children. We have this sense of wonder, of miracles, of sort of extravagant views of belief. But as we grow and we become more critical and we see shortcomings and imperfections and flaws, we need to come to what he called a second naivete, the sort of the guileless belief of the child is the first naivete. And it's sort of impossible not to have that. But as you mature, you're integrating into your life a lot of a more critical eye. And that second naivete is, I think, what this conference was all about, finding a way of believing in Ellen White while still acknowledging her shortcomings, realizing she does not leap tall buildings in a single bound. And
Dr. Fortan, would you be so kind, as one who teaches pastors? Gerald's question seems to be: can Ellen White be part of a healthy Christian Protestant church?
That was a very, very good question, Gerald. One of the assumptions of us gathering at PUC for this conference was that all of us around the tables took for granted all of the issues that have been discussed and revealed for the last many decades regarding how Ellen White wrote her books, how Marianne Davis and others helped prepare the books, how Ellen White, the difficulties with the meaning of the word inspiration of Ellen White. We took all of that for granted. And so we didn't have to convince one another. We didn't have to argue about this. We did not have to apologize for it. We came to the table with that kind of understanding. Hence, I think for us as academics in the field of Ellen White, and if we want Ellen White to have a role in the future, I would say as an academic, I would say that a lot of these things that have been discovered, revealed, talked about, published about Ellen White must become mainstream. And I mean by this that when new people, pastors, when evangelists, pastors, teachers teach new people about Ellen White, that all of that kind of information about Ellen White is also going to be discussed, given at the same time or in a short period of time. That it's not going to be some kind of mythology about Ellen White that is going to be presented to the new Adventist or to the young Adventists in our academies and colleges, but a real Ellen White that has its flaws and all that we know about how these books and manuscripts were put together, so that no one anymore is going to be disillusioned when they hear these things about Ellen White. So they can pick up Ellen White, and as I've said, perhaps read her as a devotional author, perhaps later on she may become more for them, more authoritative, but Ellen White, is what we make of her and how she relates to us and how we relate to her. Not everybody is the same, but at least that there would be a genuine honesty among pastors and evangelists and school teachers when Ellen White is presented to new people or to young adults. I think that needs to become mainstream. Another thing I've said also is that any new publications of the books of Ellen White, and that could be done very easily on the web, all of the online editions of Ellen White's books. New prefaces need to be written for all of these books, in which, in the prefaces, it's going to be said, explained, who helped Ellen White prepare this book, how it was put together, what are some of the other authors that Ellen White used to prepare this book, perhaps even give some examples, 2 columns here, compare the 2 authors, so that this whole issue of plagiarism is going to be immediately faced and put into a context, and people will still be able to read Ellen White, but knowing that, some of these things happen. Nonetheless, what is being said is informative within its context, but it is also something we can cherish spiritually. Having said all of this here, is that going to happen? I don't know, but I would plead with our church leaders, those that are the guardians of historical archives, and of the books of Ellen White, that something like this should be done for Ellen White to have a long-term future, I think, in our church.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let me ask one more question. Others need to speak, but I want to ask this one. You have a select group who understood those things, still chose to remain part of the church, and could come together for a conference like this. How many of your peers, in studying and acknowledging those facts, had to choose to no longer be a participant?
Somebody want that one?
Well, I knew a fellow who learned in his adulthood. He had a wife and children. He learned that the world was not 6,000 years old, that Ussher's chronology was inaccurate. And so he left his wife and his infant children and went off on his own. That seemed to me kind of an extreme answer. I'm sure there are people who have left Seventh-day Adventism over some of the historical revelations. I think probably, and this goes back to Laura's point, I think it might be less that the revelations were a problem than how the church reacted to them. When Ron Numbers wrote his book in the mid-70s at Loma Linda, he immediately lost his job, right? And he went off to Madison and landed on his feet at the University of Wisconsin. But he went to attend a Seventh-day Adventist church there, and a White Estate official came to the church and delivered a sermon to this little Adventist group, explaining how they should have nothing to do with Ron Numbers, that he was sort of diabolical, and so he left that little Madison church and never attended again. He recently died, and we had a memorial for him at Loma Linda, and I was very proud of Loma Linda for putting on the memorial for him and celebrating him for all the work he had done on Adventist history. I think the church is maturing, but we can all tell these war stories, and it's nice to see when it does mature and people are able to embrace members with different views of Ellen White, and still keep them in the flock.
Let me move along to Ray or Bobby. I suspect Ray is going to be speaking here. Please join the conversation.
What troubles me the most about this issue, as well as some other parts of our theology, is we claim to have this belief in the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit being a guide for the individual. But yet we tunnel all that through, in some instances, through EGW or through particular biblical interpretations, so that to me it seems like we don't have a real belief in that being part of the individual Christian's life. Because if somebody says, I believe this, I'm feeling, or I believe God has talked to me in this way, immediately we go to a whole set of criteria to determine that. So we seem to invalidate the belief in the Holy Spirit in much of our theology, and especially when it comes to EGW. Because if he can speak to me, he or she or whatever, why do I need to be filtered through someone else? Is the Holy Spirit available to the individual or not?
Laura? Everybody's gone silent here. Let me see. Jonathan, are you still unmuted?
Yeah, I'm
getting,
unmuted.
I'm not getting Laura to unmute here. I don't know why.
Yeah, I don't see her right now. I don't know.
Yeah, she's here, but she's not checking. She's probably taking a little break. Denis, are you still here? There you go. I'll unmute you. There you go.
Yes, I'm here. Yes. I mean, Ray, you've asked a good question. In fact, a good comment. The gift of the Spirit to each one of us, and how do we relate to that, and how do we let the Spirit speak to us? I mean, I concur. We're having a little difficulty with that as a church. The gift of prophecy is focused on only one person. It's not really shared around the circle in the local congregation. And we've perhaps got some work to do, and to let people have that personal relationship with God as well. I mean, I just resonate with what you said. It's a good observation. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much.
If
Art
we look
Clem.
at it, oh, go ahead.
Art Clem.
Okay. I've probably said a lot of what I have to say in the chat, but not everybody reads those. What was it, Joel, where the prophet said that in the end times your young woman will dream dreams and have visions, and she'll become old, and then when she dies, that's it. You're done for. Wasn't that? Did I have that quite right? I can't remember. I think a good point was made by some of our presenters about, how, for instance, I think that one's mother was referred to. When I was a young kid, I thought my mom was, she had it all together. She knew darn near everything. She was somebody you could trust for anything. She was pretty much infallible. But then I began to grow older. I matured a bit, and I realized that my mother wasn't all those things. And it doesn't mean that I said I don't want anything to do with the fact that she was my mother. I'm now have no parent. What I said was, I'll take some of the things that she said that I think are still valuable, but she said a lot of stuff that just doesn't make sense, and I let that go. And it doesn't mean that I hate my mother or her memory. It doesn't mean that I deny that she was my mother. It just means, we grow up, we mature. And I think it's well past time that the church mature. And instead of setting her up as some kind of goddess, that we move on and read some other material, not just her. There are people out there who feel they can only safely read the spirit of prophecy. And of course, even that term is sort of a humorous thing. The church finds a phrase in Revelation that says, that's us. We've got a prophet. So the spirit of prophecy is us. Well, maybe the Mormons have it. In fact, they have an ongoing prophet. Their church president is a prophet, seer, and revelator today. And when he dies, there'll be another one, and it will be another he. You can be sure of that. But so maybe they're the ones with the spirit of prophecy, and not the Adventist church. So I'm not there. Some of the things I feel like the church always wants to protect us from ourselves and protect us from any new knowledge. I doubt that any of you, I know my old academy roommate, Jerry Lofthouse, I bet that when he was treating his patients, he didn't say, well, I pretty much believe that whatever was believed in the 1880s is the way I should treat you now. That's where we really reach the apex of human understanding. Now, of course, he didn't do that. And none of you in any of your fields of expertise did that as well. You looked at what the latest was and how we had gained in knowledge. And I think it's well past time that we do that. I read the Spectrum article about this great disappointment meeting down in October, down at October 22 this year at PUC. And I think it ran 3 days or something like that. I was greatly disappointed by that. And the reason I was greatly disappointed by it is we were told that in the article that Gil Valentine made a statement or told about some history of Ellen White that he had found that shocked a lot of the people there. And these weren't typical Adventists pulled out of the pews. These were people who had credentials and had a long history of studying Ellen White. They were shocked. But we were protected from that information because somehow it just wouldn't be right for us to know that. I guess maybe there was an agreement in advance saying nobody's going to share any of that information. And maybe it's going to be in Gil Valentine's next book. And if it is, I look forward to reading it. But I feel like what the church uses Ellen White for is how she used it herself and how she did things herself. When I read books like Gil Valentine's J.N. Andrews, I think John mentioned that book. What was really important to Ellen White at that time was submission. Submission by those like Uriah Smith and like J.N. Andrews and other leaders at that time. They had to submit to her authority. And that's what the church wants to use her as now. And I think that's a shame. I hope we can grow up. Thanks. That's all I have to say.
I think Art raises a good point here that has crossed my mind several times. And I see Ron Graybill unmuted himself here. And that is that we're getting some very contrasting messages about how we're supposed to view Ellen White. Though the vast majority of people aren't listening to a meeting chaired by Eric Anderson at PUC, they're listening to the General Conference president. And his view is quite different from the view that Denis Fortin suggested when he said we should read her devotionally. It's a much more authoritative one. So I would like you to discuss that contrasting, that conflicting messaging. Ron, you unmuted. Do you want to join me here and say something? Ron, I'm not hearing you.
Oh, see, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make a comment on Gil Valentine's presentation that kind of surprised even those of us who were there and so on, because he was looking at Ellen White's temperament. And I think that even we who keep insisting on we need to look at the examples of the biblical prophets and we need to look at the context and all of that sort of, we were surprised when he showed how severe and harsh and unforgiving Ellen White seemed to be at times. And then I started thinking about some of the biblical prophets. My word, if some of the biblical prophets, well, let's put it this way. Some of the biblical prophets, I think, had plenty of harsh things to say and probably weren't the kind of gentle, persuasive, affirming personalities that we would like to have for our prophet. So I think, again, we need to put these things in the context of the Bible, in the context of the times. And okay, so Ellen White said some things and said them in ways to people that we think was a bit harsh and unflattering. But let's grow up. Let's get used to it. Let's put it in context and let's go on.
Well, let me tweak this just a little bit. Lauren, are you still there?
Mm-hmm.
Am I still
there? We're hearing you.
What Gil said, this was at a Sabbath afternoon meeting in which he was dealing with Ellen White's temperament. Really, the content of it was not brand new. The best place to read about it is in his biography of J.N. Andrews, which is really a triography. It's James White, Ellen White, and J.N. Andrews, although the focus is on Andrews. And it's toward the end of that book where he deals with these very harsh letters that Ellen White wrote to Jane Andrews. I think in a sense she was representing James, who had difficulties with Jane Andrews. I think jealousy of him, really, but she kind of took his side against Andrews. So what Gill did was not totally new there, and if you want to read some of this, you can in his book. And there's other places where you see her temperament surfacing. For example, she tended to have trouble with other women, the wives of some of the leadership. Harriet Smith, for example, Uriah Smith's wife, who they were very close in proximity and worked together in a lot of ways. Harriet was her seamstress, but she could be ruthless in relation to Harriet. What Gill did in that session, there were some people at that afternoon, home that had not heard some of this and were a little flabbergasted. But yeah, I think that what Gill did that was new was to deal with it kind of psychologically or sociologically. How can we sort of approach this? But it's again going back to this point that Ellen White was a human being, and God is using a human being, not an angel, when he speaks through her.
I'm going to move on then to Gina Jett. Gina.
Thanks. I'm not an Ellen White scholar. I should preface my comments by that. And it was probably only within the last 10 years that I learned that many of books that I'd been led to believe were her books were actually compilations put together by the church and marketed under another title and where they had picked and chosen from different books or things that she had written. I'd like to know whether that is a correct understanding, and if it is, I would think that there was something, to use Laura's phrase, about how the church sells itself by putting together compilations to advance certain narratives or ideas that the church wanted to be who they were, by giving the authority of Ellen White. And I'm interested to know if there's any scholarship on taking her texts. I think Denis Fortin talked about Steps to Christ as being her work, as opposed to something like, and I don't know what the compilations are, Messages to Young People or Adventist Home, where things are picked and chosen to advance a certain narrative, which may or may not have been the context in which she wrote it. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but that's my question.
Dr. Fortin, I'll throw this one in your direction since you did some work on sources in Christ.
In the short answer to your question is that yes, all the books of Ellen White are compilations, but let me explain here. Certainly the books after Ellen White died, after 1915, Ellen White gave permission to her trustees, and which became the White Estate, to continue to publish books of her made up of compilations of some of her writings on some topics. Were these compilations guided by some kind of ideology of whoever did the compilation at the time? Yes, certainly. We know that. It's obvious. Some compilations are a little bit more stricter than others. Take, for example, Counsels on Diets and Food is a very do this, do that, very authoritarian type of book, the way it's put together, very little context for these little snippets of quotes. There are other books like this as well since the time of Ellen White. So all of those are really compilations. But how about the books before Ellen White died? They are also almost all of them compilations of some kinds, but here is what that means. Very few of the books of Ellen White that she herself published during her lifetime were composed from page 1 to page 200, from cover to cover. Ellen White wrote a number of many testimonies, many letters, many church articles. Her assistants, after she began to employ some in the 1870s, would take some of those papers, articles, manuscripts. They would cut and paste from those documents to create the books of Ellen White under the supervision of Ellen White. So all of our cherished books, Steps to Christ, Desire of Ages, Patriarchs and Prophets, Christ Object Lessons, they are all these kinds of compilations where the earlier writings of Ellen White are repurposed in different contexts, creating new paragraphs, new chapters into new books. They are all done like that. And since from 1878 until 1904, they were done, most of them were done by Marianne Davis. After Marianne Davis died, C.C. Chrysler came on board to help Ellen White, and some of the later books were, but there are very few books in the last decade of Ellen White's life. Ron Graybill has written also about this, a number of articles in the Ellen White Encyclopedia that I edited with Jerry Moon, a good 10 years ago, published a good 10 years ago, has a number of articles on these books as well in the process of that. This is nothing new. It's just not prevalent and it's not current knowledge. I hope
Denis, did these people who were her secretaries, her amanuenses, do you have any evidence that they had any conflict, personal conflict about whether this was a good thing or not?
Well, yeah, we do have some evidence. We do have some letters from some of them, Fanny Bolton being one of them, who's a controversial assistant to Ellen White. But we also have some little bit of comments here and there in some of the other letters where people are wondering, should we talk about this? Should we say this a little bit more obviously? Ron Graybill knows more about this. Fred Veltman, in his study of the Desire of Ages, published a number of these letters between Marianne Davis and Whitty White and Edson White about the process that she went through to do the editing and compilation of the books of Ellen White. So we've got a number of factors coming into play here. But Ron knows more and has more information too.
Ron, I've unmuted you. I know that one of the things that was mentioned at the 1918 Bible Conference, 1918 to 1919, was that she had approached some folks and said, can you help me to update the history in my books? And this bothered Elder Butler a great deal. Hello, are you there, Ron?
Yeah.
I can't hear you. There you go. Gotcha.
Our own sort of struggling with this idea of these being compilations that were influenced and selected by others, again, sort of suggests that we're confining the Holy Spirit's work to Ellen White. And we have to believe that Marianne Davis and these others were insincere in helping to convey the message as well. Now, I will say that the things that were, first of all, Ellen White wrote these things by hand. Her handwriting was sometimes passable, sometimes horrible. And so then the literary assistant had to transcribe those things. And as they transcribed them, they sometimes just corrected the spelling and the grammar and the so on and so forth. But sometimes they virtually rewrote what she wrote. So this is why I have urged that the White Estate ought to scan and make available, more readily available, all of those holographs, all of those handwritten documents, so people can decide for themselves. But, you have these vicious critics who will make the worst of everything. So instead of just publishing that stuff online, I think they ought to put them at the various Ellen White research centers around the world and on computers that are not connected to the internet, but so that we don't all have to go to Silver Spring, Maryland to actually see the handwritten stuff, so we can make up our own mind about it. But anyway, as we look at these things, we have to realize that the gift of prophecy was in a context of its time and place, but in the context of this group of people who were helping her. She approved the way her stuff was rewritten during the time that she was alive, but after she died, there were a lot of things that were added, that were transcribed, that hadn't been transcribed during her lifetime. And in some of those cases, some things that were done that were downright unethical. I think particularly of something that Arthur White did. Ellen White had, when we found these Lucinda Hall letters, we found out that Ellen White had asked her daughter-in-law to get her a few cans of good oysters and some herring and so on. Well, when Arthur White had that letter transcribed and put on the file, he left out the mention of oysters and herring. Well, I was there at the White Estate, and Alta Robinson was there at the same time, and she was kind of a rebel herself. So she came to me and she said, "Did you know that this letter actually mentioned oysters? And look at it, look at here, it's left out with no ellipses." So she and I went to Arthur White, and I said, "This is not the way it should be." And so then that letter was retyped, put on the file, and it's online today. You can look in the letters online, and you can look for the word oysters and find out that Ellen White asked for some oysters. Now, of course, our far right defenders of Ellen White said, "Oh, we have no evidence that she ate them. Maybe she just got oysters for her cats." Oh, of course. So anyway, we have some real fun working with that. Now, I recently got interested again in Fanny Bolton, because when Fanny was Ellen White's secretary, she came from a background of writing, and she was trained in the proper ethics of authorship and all of this sort of thing. And so when she discovered how much she was changing the actual wording of what Ellen White wrote, and realizing that neither she nor any of the other literary assistants got any recognition, or the readers of this stuff had no idea what contributions they were, this kind of grated on her. And then when she then discovered that some of the passages were borrowed from other writers, that grated on her too. And so she started to rumor that around and everything, and she got fired. Actually, she got fired 3 times and hired 4 times. No, 4 times. I guess she got fired 4 times. And you sort of wonder, well, my goodness, was Ellen White just bringing her back? It was safer to have her in the house than out there spreading this sort of thing. So I think I'm gonna write a new article. I don't know if I'll send it to you, Lauren, but I think I'm gonna write a new article about the Fanny Bolton case, because and of course the church criticized Fanny Bolton. "Oh, you can't trust her. She ended up in an insane asylum." Yeah, she sure did. Well, this kind of White drove her totally crazy. So anyway, I'll work on that. But we've got a lot of interesting stuff to uncover, and we're glad that we have Lauren to publish some of it, and Spectrum to publish some of it, and we'll just keep working on it and keep trying to understand it better and better.
I'm keeping an eye on the time here, Laura, and I'm going to. I think I know what George may ask, and I think I'm reading the questions and comments here from Bob. So I'm going to ask a question for everybody. There are a lot of people who have been writing Ron, as long as you're on here, you're going to be up first. There have been a lot of people here who have been saying, you say she's not a fraud, and yet she did claim to have messages that seemed to be either copied or politically motivated. And the church, while she was alive, and after she was dead, never made clear this whole system of editing and copying. They never made clear that she was saying that the Lord showed me, and then listing a list of things that were right from another book. Ron, do you have anything to say to these folks who are very concerned about this sort of thing? Was it fraud? Where, oh, Ron, I've got to get you unmuted again.
Okay. You know, for me, and again, I think Ellen White made a false statement. Now, here's where I say falsehood is intention to deceive. So Ellen White once said, I do not write one article for the paper expressing my own views. These are what the Lord has revealed to me. Well, it's true she didn't write one article for the paper expressing only her own views. But in between what the Lord revealed to her and her own views were the things she borrowed from Melville and Adersheim and all these other authors and so on. And she should have told us that. But she said it. She said that it came from God. As we worked through Don McAdams' material, we said to ourselves, well, it looks like this material about John Huss came from the histories that she read about John Huss. If she had visions about them, if she had dreams about them, it was after she read those things. Sometimes I read things and then I dream about them that night and so on. But she selected those things that do inspire us and so on. And we as a church, you talk about compilations and so on, and how the churches sort of shaped the view of Ellen White. But God bless them, they didn't put into the compilation some things that I'm just as glad that the church didn't put. But anyway, let's just keep discussing them. Let's keep describing them and understanding them, and we'll all be better off for it.
Thank you, Ron. Emmanuel, I'm keeping an eye on time here, so let's make. We've got about 40 minutes left, and we have a bunch of hands. So go ahead.
Good afternoon. I wonder if we have here a problem of cognitive dissonance starting since 1919 Bible Conference. The church member cannot know. And I found that we have some scholar, they want to rehabilitate Ellen White. And I feel like I am a smoker. Oh, smoking is not good for you, for your lung, but it's going to relax you, so keep smoking. There are problems, but there is something good, so keep it, even though there is something good. I'm smoking, I have lung cancer, but it's going to relax you. I am totally lost.
Eddie?
Thank you, brother. What can we say? I don't know what to respond. I mean, somebody else may give it a try. It's just, thank you for your thoughts.
It's maybe the first time that sticking with Ellen White has been compared to smoking. Most people gave it up, but
it's a new era. Dr. Johnston, I'm going to ask you to unmute and move along here.
Thank you. Two things. Number one, I'm astonished that anybody should be troubled by the use of an amanuensis or by compilations or by the use of sources. Jeremiah had his Baruch, Peter had his Sylvanus, Jesus had his Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Isaiah used Micah, First Peter used Jude, and so on and so on. So it astonishes me. I don't know how we set people up to be troubled by that. If you believe in the Bible, that should not be a problem with Ellen White. Second, back toward the end of the 19th century, Adventists had entered into a dialogue with the Seventh-day Baptists. In fact, there was a time when we exchanged delegates at our respective general conferences. And we talked about, we had meetings where we talked about what we differed on. And one of the things that we differed on, and this is the actual term that was used, the perpetuity of the spiritual gifts. That's the term that was used in the report that was printed in the review. The Seventh-day Baptists were cessationists. They believed that such things as the gift of prophecy ended after the apostolic age, while Seventh-day Adventists believed that we still have them today. We have become cessationists because we say that the spirit of prophecy, the gift of prophecy, ended in 1915, basically. And indeed, we had some early claimants that were pretty shabby after Ellen White died. But nevertheless, I think that's really a problem. The scandal is not that we claim to have had a prophet. The scandal is that we had only one. I think what we should do is we should change a major rubric in our list of beliefs into a subcategory. The major rubric should be the spiritual gifts, and we should explain what they are. We should explain what makes a prophet a prophet. And we may discover that, and of course, Ellen White would be an example or a subcategory. And a prophet doesn't have to be a Danielic figure that has visions and stops breathing and all that kind of thing, because you find one or two examples in the Bible. That isn't what makes a prophet a prophet. We need to explain that better and talk about some people that are even yet prophets today. And I think we've had some. So let's change what has been a major heading into a subheading and make our major heading the perpetuity of spiritual gifts, the term that we used back toward the end of the 19th century. Thank you.
Excellent comment, Laura.
I love what Dr. Johnston was saying. Yeah, the fact that Ellen White is the exclusive extra-biblical prophet for Adventism today puts a lot of pressure on her, especially as the fundamentalist movement sweeps through American Christianity and Adventism as well. And shortly after her death, and it's kind of growing before she died even, you can see in the 1919 Bible Conference, we've got people who know how Ellen White's literary process worked, and they're trying to resist this fundamentalist view, and they just get bowled over by the wave of it. I look back at history sometimes and think that with the example of Ellen White, that should have been a kind of inoculation for the Adventist Church against fundamentalism. We could say, oh no, inspiration doesn't work exactly that way, where you have word for word messages from God through the prophet and they don't need any contextualization. We know that that's not the way it worked in the Bible, because that's not the way it worked for Ellen White. Unfortunately, it wasn't sufficient. Our understanding of Ellen White, you saw those leaders who tried to protest about there's this literary process and there are these nuances to it. They just kind of got pushed aside as fundamentalism took over the American Christian culture, at least conservative Protestant Christianity at that time. And it is unfortunate, because we have to relearn these things, not just about Ellen White, but about the writers of the biblical material. And we say, oh, look, wow, we figured out that things were complex for the Bible writers. So now we can take that information and apply it back to Ellen White's story and say, it's okay for her too. And it may just be that that's how we manage to recover a more nuanced view of Ellen White. when I think it should have gone the other way in the first place, that Ellen White should have informed our reading of the Bible.
You make a really good point, Laura. Some of you may remember Dr. Rice from the seminary. His first name is escaping me right now, who studied Luke. Do you remember?
George Rice. George Rice.
George Rice, yes. And he wrote a couple pieces in ministry. And even at the time, I was a little shocked that he was saying, well, it's okay for Ellen White to borrow because Luke borrowed. And all of a sudden we were plunged into a sort of source criticism because we had to defend Ellen White, if you know what I mean. That's how it came across to those of us who were pastors out in the field and reading George Rice's piece. By the way, I took class from him in seminary. He was a very good teacher, and I appreciated him a lot. But I thought that was rather interesting. Denis, I think we're back to, again, sort of trying to struggle with whether Ellen White can be a pastoral part of the church. And this is really hard for some people.
Yeah, very true. Thank you. Yeah.
And I'm going to move on to, thank you, Dr. Johnson. That was a very, very helpful point. Bob Martin, Dr. Martin, please let me unmute you here.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren. Whole Ellen White question for me came since I was a lad in the islands. I remember a discussion in my home, my parents' home as a lad, maybe 9, 10, and about the authenticity of Ellen White. And then my mom says to me, oh, well, at church next Sabbath, they're going to have an experiment to prove that Ellen White was authentic. So they said that, one of the signs that she was an authentic prophet from God was that she was able to outstretch her hand with a heavy Bible, and she held it for 7 and 8 hours, something to that effect. I know you're familiar with it. So in church that Sabbath afternoon, they got the strongest deacon in the church, Brother Ford, and he was outstretched his hand with a couple of Bibles on it because they said that her Bible was heavier than was there. And sure enough, Brother Ford was not able to hold up those Bibles the way Ellen White did. And she said, see, Bobby, see, she was the right prophet. She was the prophet from God. So I've always had some interest in her authenticity as a prophetess. Now, my question is this: and I've read Ron's book and his books and much of the Ellen White issues. My question is this: the fact that at this late stage in Adventism, we are still roiled by her role, and if she's a fake or not, or if she's still relevant, isn't that in itself a problem? Isn't that a big red flag? And secondly, I agree with Dr. Denny said about what is needed. Absolutely what is needed. However, I don't think it will ever happen. Will not happen. Why? And this comes to my second question. The fact that Ellen White is a founder of Adventism. She was one of she served as the backbone of Adventism, and her ministry, the evolution of her ministry and early Adventism, where an Adventist sought to differentiate themselves from Charles Russell and Joseph Smith to show that we are the true church, the only authentic church, and our foundation was built around that. So regarding Dr. Gerald's issue about separating Adventism from Ellen White, at least at a core level, that cannot happen for that reason. I think she's tied to the core of Adventism, and there can be no separation. And it's in the baptismal vow and all that. So my question, gentlemen and Laura, is this. Do you subscribe to the idea that because of that historical role of religious differentiation from Charles Russell and Joseph Smith around the same time and coming up, isn't it fairly unlikely that Ellen White can be separated from Adventism, and we as a church cannot officially relegate her to a devotional source, as Dr. Denny mentioned, which would be excellent. But do you believe that it cannot happen for these reasons?
I'm going to ask Ron to address the Bible story briefly, and then Dr. Fortan, second question is addressed to you. So Ron, go ahead.
A very good friend who's a very diligent and very excellent Ellen White scholar, but very, very conservative. And we get along just fine, and we share information and research and so on and so forth. But
you're talking about Kevin.
But he has a great deal of confidence in J. Loughborough. And I've written an article about Loughborough, J.N. Loughborough, historian, ? Because I find that Loughborough is a very unreliable historian. But because Loughborough supports his view of Ellen White, he has a great deal of respect for J.N. Loughborough. So let me just say that I've written a lot of articles over the years in different places, and I am currently working and bringing all my articles and book chapters together. I'm going to publish a book called Life Works in Adventist History by Ron Graybill. So you can read my article about Loughborough there. And then also about the Big Bible. Well, you know, the stories that we have about the Big Bible are based on hearsay evidence, okay? And you know, I'm not trying to say that she never held a Bible miraculously and so on and so forth, but I'm saying that we can raise reasonable doubt because a lot of the evidence for some of these things is what a lawyer would call hearsay evidence. And it comes from some places, some people who have obvious biases. So that's another aspect of Ellen White studies and Adventist history studies, is to look at how we will treat the different types of evidence. But I have an article on the Big Bible, Bigger Steel, and on J.N. Loughborough, whether he was a historian.
And we're ready to publish it. Dr. Fortan, I think Bob was addressing part of that question to you.
And in part here, the answer to the question is, can we separate Ellen White from the Seventh-day Adventist Church and still remain Seventh-day Adventist? No, I don't think so. I don't think that's possible because she is one of our founders. We will not deny her. We will not reject her. We can't do that. She's part of our history. We cannot deny our history. She's been very influential in our history with the establishment of a fair number of institutions, our educational system, our publishing houses, our hospitals and medical system. If we have all that we have today, it's because of her influence. Our mission work also to all places in all the world. That is also the product of her influence, and an influence for all of these institutions that still continues today. So we may have our issues with how she wrote her book, about issues of honesty, issues of integrity, how the church handled her writings and the mythology around her. All right, we have all of these issues. But be those as it may, I think Ellen White is there to remain and to stay. I do believe, however, I want to perhaps correct something here. I do believe that we should read Ellen White as a devotional author. By all means, we should, particularly the books that are commentaries on scriptures, on the Bible stories, the conflict of the ages, and all of these books. She is a devotional author because of the way she handles scripture, the way she comments on scripture. She is a typical writer of the 19th century who wrote books in the evangelical mindset in that way. And so she fits very well there as far as devotional literature. But is that all she is? Now, don't take me wrong here. I think there's more to Ellen White than just devotional. I've written plenty of articles about the fact that Ellen White is also a theologian of some sort, not a trained one, not an educated one like perhaps we are, but the way she talks about a number of Bible themes and topics, there is a theology in Ellen White. There's building blocks to how to understand the world into which we live, how to understand Scripture. So great controversy, the primacy of Scripture, the love of God, the health reform, the way she understands salvation from an Armenian Wesleyan perspective. All of these are big, huge building blocks that come from a theological perspective. And I think we have those in her books, and they provide a guidance to us. I don't think we can remain Seventh-day Adventists if we deny the role, the theological role that she will have, that she must continue to have among us. Yes, she's a devotional writer, and it's a blessing. That's kind of how we're blessed by her writings. But there is more also, and I think we need to also to explore that and certainly not deny that.
Thank you.
I would say, Denis, for some of us, she's a bit of an abusive parent, if you will allow me to say so.
Say that again.
For some of us, she's a bit of an abusive parent.
Mm.
I give her great credit for the fact that coming from a working class family, I ended up being able to get a great education because of Seventh-day Adventism. Very, very proud of ADRA, very proud of Loma Linda University and all of those things. But at the same time, the way some of us were raised with Ellen White, we also had to put up with a great deal of a very harsh, fearful expectations.
Yes.
I have several times written about the fear that permeated my life as a young person, and people will say, well, a few people will jump in and say, no, that never happened. By far, the largest portion of people who grew up in the Seventh Adventist Church will say, I was terrified the entire time I was growing up by what Ellen White said in The Great Controversy. Terrified. I couldn't sleep at night. Had bad dreams. Had dreams about being lost because I didn't keep the Sabbath perfectly or I didn't eat perfectly. She functioned for some of us, Dr. Fortin, as an abusive parent.
I won't deny that, Lauren, not at all. In fact, I will resonate with that. I mean, when I became a young Seventh-day Adventist, I was a late teenager. I was steeped into last generation theology. It is a most fearful theology, and about who God is and the end time and all of this. I resonate with that very, very much. And I would say that a lot of her testimonies, the published ones, even the unpublished ones, are also that kind of very, very fearful type of approach to understanding God. Let me end with a short anecdote here on my part. Many years ago, I thought to myself, I need to read the testimonies of Ellen White. So, okay, let's start with number 1. And I've got 9 volumes to read. So that will take me a couple of years probably to do that. I had to stop at the beginning of volume 2. I couldn't take it anymore. I could not take the tone. I could not take to what appeared to me to be too strong language, too much of shaming. Maybe now, years later, I could pick them up again and read them differently. But at the time, I had to stop reading them.
Yeah. There's a great deal of, at times, almost a level of hatefulness in some of them. And I've often wondered, I don't know if anybody's ever done any research on this, but I've often wondered, to what extent did the people who she wrote these testimonies, and suddenly she wrote them a letter accusing them of horrible things, and then all of a sudden she published them publicly, and people could possibly figure out who they are. What was the result of these personal letters being made public? Were there people who just rebelled and said, I can't stand this woman?
Yeah, I relate a number of those anecdotes in the biography of George Butler that I wrote that's coming out in about a month. Yes, that happened to George Butler too, and a number of his colleagues, and that's how they responded to Ellen White. Yeah.
Looking forward to that. I am going to now, let's see, George. George, joined in the conversation. I know you and I have talked a great deal about this matter, and I know it is deeply disturbing and personal to you in some ways. Go ahead.
Thank you. I rarely come to the end of a session like this as concerned as today, because Sligo, the Faith and Reason class, had about the same theme, talking about the same things. And my concern is that I see an inability, and I'm trying to control my temperament again. We talked about temperament before. Inability to deal with the core problem, which is honesty. I heard today a lot of talking, trying to make a balance between dishonesty and, and whatever. I don't even have right words to describe what I mean, I guess, because we are dealing with a serious thing. I was 30 years old. I got 16 years of Adventist education, and I was 30 in 1980 when the Desmond Ford crisis surfaced. And at that time, it hit me hard because I was very rooted, very deep into the Adventist church. And I just had to realize and admit, honestly, that the church had duped me, as it continued doing it till today. So now we have this problem of honesty in front of us. Are we going to deal with it properly, or are we going to try to compromise? A devotional, nice. I know I read a lot of Ellen White in the past, almost all her books that were in Portuguese at that time when I lived in Brazil. And well, but what about the honesty problem? Do we still honor someone who did the things the way she did? I have a problem with that. And I know I have a problem seeing that people are not able, not willing to, or I don't know, to deal with the honesty issue. We know everything about it. We don't need more discussions about her writings, her compilations, her plagiarism. We know all that. So my question to the panel right now is only one that I didn't get an answer at Sligo, at Faith and Reason. What is the next step of this conference, this group that met and wrote the appeal? The appeal is vague. The appeal is very weak. What is the next step in real terms to find a solution for the problem of honesty and everything else related to it? Thank you.
Dr. Butler, are you still listening in here? Could you, I think this is, I just knew this is a deep concern for a lot of people. It sounds like what we've been told wasn't true, that she wasn't a genuine person. Do you want to say something about that?
Well, on the conference itself, I think people understood that it was only a beginning. We were meeting to talk about Ellen White, but we didn't intend the conversation to end there. I mean, the idea of publishing what went on, there could be a book coming out of this. Having Sabbath school classes like this one, I think is very important. Where it will go, how many minds might be changed or who could benefit, it's hard to say. But this wasn't a top-down operation where the conference was intending to pontificate and tell people what to think or believe. It was a grassroots sort of thing. We were just talking among ourselves and now sharing it. I think there's plenty to do on Ellen White to understand her more. If I could add to this, kind of shift gears a little bit here. We had all the kind of revisionism of the 70s. And since then, we've had a number of biographies, not of Ellen White, but of other people who knew her or worked with her, other leaders. I mean, it's startling that there's so little written about Ellen White in the way of a biography. I mean, the Ron Numbers book, Prophetess of Hell, still kind of stands alone on the shelf. I mean, there ought to be 20 biographies of Ellen White. But we are getting views of her in these other biographies, just like Denny's talking about with his G.I. Butler work. You know, how he related to her and related to her criticisms tells us a lot about her and how she reacted to him. And so that's been, and I think George Knight's overseen a lot of that sort of second generation history on her. But I think the more we know about her, the better off we will be. It will not, we shouldn't try to protect ourselves from this. I mean, you know, Ellen White came as she was undereducated, smart woman, but undereducated, a working class background. She had the options as a woman in a man's world of the 19th century, a patriarchal world, very limited options. She could have made hats for the rest of her life. She could have worked in a factory or been a seamstress. But she felt this calling. And, you know, she gained her seat at the table among men in a man's world, which Seventh-day Adventism was too. She gained her seat at the table as a visionary. No one would have listened to Ellen White if she didn't say, I was shown this. They weren't asking for her opinion. They weren't, oh, you're a theologian, or you read some history, tell us what you think. No, that wouldn't have gotten her a seat at the table. And in some ways, she sort of scratched and clawed. Historically, people have trouble with angry women. Men can get angry. You think James White wasn't angry? We're not spending a lot of time talking about his anger. He was explosively angry. Mm-hmm. But we do talk about a woman who's angry. And that, I think, is unfair, but it's an indication of the times. And but to know her as a woman, not just this sort of ethereal person, I think is important. But, you know, let's not be defensive about her. Let's not be hide from her. Let's explore her and understand her, and maybe we'll come out on the other side different in our view of her, but perhaps even more constructive.
Laura, let me ask you a question. You of all the people who are part of this, you're still going into the classroom and talking to young people. How has thinking about this changed the way you teach Adventist history and, well, theology, Adventist theology for that matter?
Well, the conference was only a couple of months ago, but come January, I'm going to be starting my Adventist Heritage class again. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to note that the Adventist history class is not called Adventist history, it's called Adventist Heritage. There's a certain feeling of an obligation to carry on the sense of identity there from that, but that's an aside. Once again, I have to claim my privilege. I was taught by George Knight, so in seminary, and have had access to some of this material. So I don't think the conference specifically is going to change a lot of what I teach to undergrads. However, I feel myself privileged to be able to talk to young adults, most of whom don't have really strong opinions on Ellen White, and to be able to essentially inoculate them before you go out into your little, rural church or wherever you're going to be working in your career. Let me give you an image of Ellen White that's fairly historically accurate. Now, if we were going to go into this depth, this would have to be a separate class, like probably even a separate class from the Ellen White class. It'd have to be an inspiration of Ellen White sort of thing. So I don't get to use a lot of this content, but I make sure that what I tell them is nuanced. Students know that their personality, the influences in her work, that she's got the same weaknesses and wearinesses as everybody else, that her books are group efforts. There's a use of sources and a use of help and those sorts of things. And I'm already talking to a generation of people who are, most of them, not coming from a space in which they felt like they had to make their lives conform to whatever Ellen White said. So that's an advantage. I do teach an Adventist Heritage class in the summer to teachers. I give this to teachers who are in the field teaching in Adventist elementary schools and high schools, especially all over the United States. So I like to feel like I'm contributing largely to the conversation there because of my privileged position. I feel really privileged to have been at this conference, to have met these people, to now be friends with Jonathan Butler, and to be able to get some of this firsthand from them and see what they've seen. It has to be translated into a form that is relevant to your average college student, but it's been useful.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to get in these last two people. So Ed Reifsnyder and Karsten Thompson.
Good afternoon. This is a fascinating subject, and it's the second time today I've heard it. Jonathan Butler was on Faith and Reason Sabbath School class this morning, and we talked about the same thing. I want to make 2 points. The first one is it's natural that things fade into history. I'm sure that Gibbon's books, multiple volume books about Rome, used to be a big deal. I never hear anybody talk about Gibbons anymore. It's just a natural process that as time moves on, knowledge develops, that people fade into history, even outstanding writers. And let's talk about knowledge moving on. We like to look at Ellen White's books about lifestyle, which she apparently, if we believe Mr. Numbers, gained largely from going to water treatment institutes in New York. Well, today, Harvard will tell you all about sound nutrition and do it with much more specificity and researched accuracy than Ellen White. The AARP will tell you in their monthly magazine the value of exercise with far more specificity and insight than Ellen White. Let's talk about righteousness by faith. I mean, if you read Ellen's early books, it's all about gritting your teeth and getting it done. 1888 was a revelation to her, it seems, just like it was to the rest of the church. And then came Morris Venden. Maybe we know way more about righteousness by faith today than Ellen White did. So it moves on, people fade away. Maybe what's needed right now, and yes, the young. Laura referred to the young who don't have the same perspective on Ellen White that us, the average demographic on this call today, does. So with them, the young, she's going to fade even further. So maybe what we really need is a better, more accurate perspective of who she really was, what her contributions really were, what her downsides were, so that as her memory fades away, maybe it's a more accurate memory than we have now. But the second point is strategy. Laura put the question in the chat about, okay, we know this now, what do we do with it? Who will publish all this? Maybe a book, as Jonathan said, with a review, publish extensive coverage of the works of this group. I'm dubious. Maybe they will, but I'm dubious because that's not what they say about Ellen White. Now, Adventist Today certainly will. This will be headline news in Adventist Today, which means that there's two different audiences out there. And with one of those audiences, this will not resonate because it cuts across perceived truths. With another audience, it will really resonate. I don't know that the results would change the official stance. It would probably be a long time coming and a lot of demographic change in the church. So the thoughts about using the work product of this group going forward, and I'm glad they just viewed the work done to date as a start. I'm grateful for that. Is critical as to how we go forward.
Thank you very much, Ed. We're running short of time. Karsten, I'll let you have the last word, and then I'm going to send everybody on their way. I want to thank Laura for organizing this, Dr. Graybill for joining, John Butler for joining, and Dr. Fortan. And really appreciate you pitching in here. Karsten, you have the last word.
Thank you. While listening to the seminar today, I discovered myself wandering around the living room, sat down watching some handball, a tournament with the Danish girls playing against Poland, because I've heard it all before. And sometimes I think the most healthy thing to do is to move on. Many of us need healing. Adventist Today provides a forum for that. But in the environment that I live in, we've already moved on. We don't discuss these issues in our church anymore. The young people aren't concerned about it. It's a wonderful relief to be freed from the codependency of us and Ellen White. I remember Ron Graybill once said that his wife Gerda said to him, "Ron, are you married to me or Ellen White?" Thank you to all.
Thank you very much. Thank you to those of you who are willing to pitch in and be part of the discussion. We need to carry this on a little farther, I think. And next week we have something, to quote Monty Python, something completely different. We're going to have Steve Case here, and Steve has, I don't know if he's going to talk, what he's going to talk about for sure. I know he's written a book about Revelation that emphasizes Jesus more than the prophecies, and he may be doing that, but I think he's got something else in mind this time. Steve Case is very active in the Maranatha organization, for those of you who know about that. Thank you very much for all of your help, and I'm going to say goodbye to all of you, and happy Sabbath or end of Sabbath, whatever it is for you. Bye-bye.